Informed Choice Radio, episode 418, Rewiring Brain Science for Wealth, with Dr. David Krueger.
Recorded live from Cranley in Surrey, this is Informed Choice Radio. Want to make the most of your money and your life? You've come to the right place. Here at Informed Choice, we believe that when it comes to your money, the more you know, the faster it can grow. Now, here's your host, Chartered Financial Planner, Martin Bamford.
Neuroscientists estimate that over 90% of our operating systems, our beliefs, behaviours and patterns, are unconscious. Since the surface story determines less than 10% of our decisions, how can we illuminate the shadow story responsible for over 90% of what we do each and every day? Once we systematically understand our relationship with money, can we overcome the mind and brain's resistance to change? Especially when so many of the current popular strategies for change are contrary to the way the mind and brain work. My guest on the podcast on Informed Choice Radio today is David Krueger MD. He's an executive coach and CEO of MentorPath, an executive coaching, training, publishing and wellness firm. His work integrates psychology and neuroscience with strategic coaching to help executives and professionals write the next chapter of their life or business stories. His new book is called Your Money Story, where he writes about how each money storyline contains unspoken assumptions, emotional agendas, and unconscious meanings. The book combines 25 years of psychiatric and psychoanalytic practice and over a dozen years of professional and executive mentor coaching with groundbreaking research in psychology, neuroscience, and behavioural economics. Here's David Krueger MD in episode 418 of Informed Choice Radio with Your Money Story. So David, could you start by introducing yourself, telling us a bit about you and about what you do?
Are we recording now?
Yeah, good to go, yes, yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Dave Krueger. I'm an executive mentor coach. My coaching firm is MentorPath, and my website, MentorPath, is about the work that I do with performing and practicing professionals and executives to incorporate the mind and brain sciences with strategic coaching to make changes that last.
Okay, and you're an MD, so you have a medical background?
I practiced psychiatry and psychoanalysis and was clinical professor of psychiatry at Baylor College of Medicine for 25 years. And a dozen years ago, I made a wholesale transition into mentor coaching. And now I train my own wellness coaches and financial coaches. And I'm also a faculty member and Dean of Curriculum at Coach Training Alliance. But primarily what I do is work with individuals and do that worldwide.
And we're talking today about your new book. It's called Your New Money Story. So what are some of the stories that we tell ourselves when it comes to money matters?
Well, money can make any statement and carry any message. And we each have money stories, whether we recognize them or not. For example, we use money in our storylines of who we are, what money means to us, what money says about us. It's a running dialogue of how much we think we deserve, how much we think we're worth, how much we're capable of. And it's about what would happen if we had more or less. So without realizing it, we use money every day to tell a story about ourselves and our lives, and our money story permeates everything we do. It sort of ghostwrites every aspect of our lives, because what we eat, drink, read, fear, plan, buy, all are affected by our money story. Our health, our jobs, our families, our dreams are also impacted by that money story. So day by day, that money story becomes our life story.
And how much of that money story is written through unconscious, subconscious behaviors? How much of it are we consciously in control of?
Neuroscientists have confirmed and shown again and again that about 90 to 95% of our operating system is unconscious. So that means that there are so many of our decisions that are determined by the unconscious attachment and behavior and emotional patterns that have been laid down for some time that have become the default mode. So what we see are the resultant behaviors and the stories that we create. So that's the challenge in looking at understanding these stories, so that if they don't work, or if they could work better or be optimized, that we can know the algorithms that are operative that determine these unconscious choices, and have a systematic way to address that, to change those stories.
I'm sure some people listening to that would feel a little bit unnerved that so much of our decision making, so much of our daily lives are subject to unconscious bias, I guess. How do we recognize when, in particular in relation to money, when it's unconscious behavior taking the lead and making those decisions for us?
Well, it usually works very well because we make so many of the decisions in an automatic default way. That means we don't have to think about it. We don't have to use energy in doing it. Think about, for example, when you drive the same way to work every day. You, after a period of time, after a month or so, you don't have to think about it. The brain optimizes that by creating pathways and networks to make that automatic, so you can do other things like listen to a book. When that usual path is not accessible, like there's a parrot, you have to snake your way through it. You have to work at it. So it takes energy. So usually our default methods work. And the ones that don't work, those we can become aware of, to look at and understand in order to go about change. And that's where what we want to, when I say incorporating the mind and brain sciences, that is a way to look at and understand how our minds and brains operate, to look at what we want to change, and to have a systematic way to change. For example, when you want to change a habit that's not working, and you come to see that it's not working, looking at the goal is not enough. You have to look at the system, the stepwise system, in order to do that, so that you get an appreciation of how to do that step by step, and look at changing the basic fundamentals, the brain algorithms that is a story that doesn't work, for example, or that can be optimized for better performance.
Once we've recognized those issues, though, is it relatively straightforward to change and to optimize our decision making, or are we quite resistant sometimes to changing, particularly our financial behaviors?
We're amazingly resistant, even when a story doesn't work, even when a story is limiting or compromising. We continue to do it, maybe even do it harder, hoping it would work. Why is it so hard to change a story? Well, from a mind standpoint, we do what we know the outcome for. We do what we're accustomed to doing, and we confuse sometimes repetition and knowing the outcome with effectiveness. So we tend to do what we're from. A body at rest tends to stay at rest. A body in motion tends to stay. We keep repeating the same story, even though it may have a glass ceiling or limited results. From a brain perspective, here's a brief story about how that happens, and it alludes to your earlier question. Milton Erickson, when he was a boy, would get up. He's a noted hypnotherapist, and I'm sure most of the listeners will know immediately who that is. When he was a boy, he would get up early and create a new pathway in the snow to school. What he noticed was that everyone followed in the same pathway. Not a single person created a new pathway. He would increasingly do, in days after that, diabolical circuitous routes. No person created a new pathway. That's the way behaviors and memories are laid down in our brain. Early patterns and repeated, they become the default mode. And to do something different means we have to change. That's not easy, because As soon as we do something different, immediately our brain error detection mechanism says something's wrong, meaning that that's not what's expected. Our brain is a pattern recognition organ. We do something twice in a row, the brain expects the third to repeat. A stock moves up 2 quarters in a row, we sort of automatically expect a third rise to follow. So sometimes we have to do something that's contrary to what feels right, what's automatic, and what there's automatic mind and brain resistance for. This is why a system is needed, both to recognize what needs to change and to go about a way of changing it. Because when you want to change a habit, also, in addition to having a system, you need to disrupt the pattern that's there in order to create a new one. If you just add a new pattern, it's kind of like, adding a new health club membership. Usually that doesn't work unless there's a system, unless you disrupt the usual pattern in order to create a new one, because that pattern, like that pathway in the snow, is a superhighway in the brain. And traveling down that superhighway is easy. It may not get us to where we want to go, but it's easy travel. And to disrupt that would be to leave that easy travel on the superhighway, to take a machete to underbrush and create something new that's going to be uncomfortable from the beginning. So this is where maybe collaboration with a mentor coach can be helpful in developing that new story, to recognize, observe, and consistently to understand an example here of how the mind and brain works, to reframe that discomfort that's natural, the anxiety or discomfort of doing something new and different. If it's read as anxiety equals danger, better head for cover, or my gut's telling me this is not the right thing to do, then it makes sense to stop. So this new behavior, when it's informed and in a framework of change, can be reframed to be a signpost of being in new territory, evidence of moving ahead. So that moves that behavior into a new model. And that's what's needed to make change, and that new model being incorporated into one's identity is what needs to happen for that change to be permanent. And the reason there is the most powerful force of the human psyche is we always return to what's our core identity. We make a behavior change. Unless that's incorporated into an identity change, we're going to return to that identity. So changes need to be incorporated into the working model of how and who we see ourselves to be. And when that identity is transformed along with the behavior in an informed and systematic way, that's dynamite, because that change is going to stay and be enhanced. That's optimizing performance in an ideal way.
And our core identity, is this something also which is established early on and as a result of repeated patterns?
Our core identity is just the way that we see ourselves, that's informed by those default modes, the patterns of attachment, the patterns of behavior and emotion. We typically respond in a relationship in a similar way, and those core patterns will be identifiable because they're hardwired. We do something repeatedly, it becomes hardwired. So it becomes automatic, easy to do. So we have to assess, is it really working or not? Is it in our best interest? Does it fit the current context? A concept from psychoanalysis is a transference bias, that we have software in place that's tailor-made for an earlier situation. Now, if it still works, that's outstanding because it doesn't take any energy. But if the situation or we have changed and that earlier software is now outdated, that can be a bias.
Mm.
And if we automatically operate on it, we have to have a specific way of assessing, is it working in the best way possible now?
I know within the book you describe a roadmap system. So I guess it's the system for changing these patterns, these repeated patterns, changing these default behaviors. Could you introduce us to that roadmap system? Tell us a bit about it.
Absolutely. This is a 7-step process that's simply a way of deconstructing and understanding a story as well as constructing a revised or a new one. And this is simply a way to understand the algorithms that comprise the default ways that we operate to make that conscious and specific. It's a system of understanding and revising. So what that is then is, first we have to recognize the money story that we're writing, to recognize that whatever we do, think, feel, and experience, we're creating each moment. And to look at honestly observing the second step. The roadmap is the 7-step acronym. So the second is to observe whether that's really working or not, and to own the story, to own that we are creating. It's not there unless we create it or agree to it. To then assess what's working and what's not, to make determinations of what we want to change in order to focus on that even more specifically. And then to decide what to change, to look at making an active plan of deciding what to change in a stepwise way. Now, often what looks like resistance, for example, in a client, may be simply that they don't know what the next step is. So the decision is about looking at a stepwise process that makes it doable, attainable, a next step. And let me tell you a brief story. Terry Fox ran the Marathon of Hope, a 3,339-mile run across Canada. He was challenged because he had an artificial leg. He was interviewed immediately after the race and asked, how in the world did you do it when you were exhausted and still had thousands of miles ahead? And his answer was simply, I just ran to the next telephone pole. Now, that's a beautiful example of shrinking the change to a next step. He had a goal in mind. He knew where those telephone poles were going, those thousands of miles ahead, but all he did was the next step. And then, I mean, that's analogous to ideally what we do in life. All we need to do is the next best thing, the next best action. We need to have that in a stepwise progression, though, to reach a goal. So then the next step, mapping change, is to go from the deciding what to change to mapping how that's going to look, what's going to be done specifically in a priority, in a schedule, in a very specific way. And then author changes to actually put it into action. It's not a theory anymore. One of the things that we've seen in neuroscience research just in the last 2 or 3 years is how important it is to put a plan or ideas into action, an output channel, because that completes the circuit in the brain. A simple example, this is out of England. When someone, a control group, half of the people read a story to themselves, the other half read a story, same story, out loud. The people who read it out loud had a 40% better retention and test score on the content than the people who simply read it to themselves. And the last step is program new identity, to incorporate it as, this is not something I'm doing, this is me. This is where a mentor coach, for example, comes into play, of recognizing, pardon me, and transforming changes into, this is who I am, this is my identity, this is a new working model of who I am. It's sort of like, your lap when you get up. your lap is a memory. You can always recreate it, but it sort of impedes forward progress. But it becomes a part of the flow of who you are. And when it becomes the automatic default mode, it becomes easy, because this is what our brains have done in evolutionary time, is to make new wiring and new neural networks for what we do automatically. So this is a way to truly engage the mind and brain sciences to make changes that last ultimately into that new identity. And that can also help someone to recognize whenever they hear the lure of the lap, of sitting down, whenever they hear negative self-talk, or I can't do it, or I can't make enough money. This is an example of using this model to look at another answer to your initial question. Is our surface story operates on what's logical, conscious, and intellectual. Since this is only about 5 to 10% of what we actually are aware of, the unconscious system, the shadow story, is that 90 or more percent that operates sometimes contrary to the surface story. An example, a surface story: I want to generate more income and create wealth. Now, if the shadow story, conscious or not, goes in the opposite direction and says, well, I don't think I really have what it takes, or I wasn't really made to have wealth, or wealth is not really spiritual. If anything goes in the opposite direction, somebody gets stuck. So this is a way to begin to understand that shadow story, so that needs and ideals, strategies and goals can all go in the same direction. When all of someone's going in the same direction, that's dynamite, and it's powerful.
David, it's a fascinating subject. I really do appreciate your time today to go through those concepts. Before I let you go, where can we find out more about your work, and how can we get hold of a copy of your book?
My website is mentorpath.com, mentorpath.com. There's a CD series that's also digital, especially designed for people in Great Britain. www.newmoneystory.com. And I don't know if you have a way to send out to your listeners. I sent a flyer from my publisher that's based in New York and London, a pre-publication copy of the book that's coming out 1 month from now at a 30% discount that can be sent in. If you have a way to send it to your publishers, that's great. But it will be available online or at bookstores.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I make sure in the show notes for this episode, we put links to the websites, links to that flyer as well, so our listeners can take advantage of that very generous offer from you for the 30% discount. David, thank you so much for your time. That's been great to chat to you.
It's been a privilege. I really appreciate it.
A big thank you to David for joining us today on Informed Choice Radio. Do check out the show notes at icradio.co.uk for a link to David's new book. It's called Your Money Story: The Beliefs, Behaviours and Brain Science to Rewire for Wealth. Until next time, I'm Martin Bamford, and this is Informed Choice Radio. And remember, when it comes to your money, the more you know, the faster it can grow.